There's a moment tucked inside one of the most beloved films of the 1980s that nobody caught on opening weekend. Nobody caught a year later either. It took decades of frame-by-frame rewatching, VHS pausing, and eventually digital scrubbing before fans realized that something in this movie simply should not exist. It wasn't removed. It wasn't patched in a re-release. It has been sitting in plain sight since 1985, waiting for someone sharp enough to notice. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and by the end of this video, neither will you. But to understand why this mistake matters so much, we need to go back to where the whole story began. Not in 1955, and not in a DeLorean, but in a cramped writer's room where two friends were chasing an idea that almost nobody wanted. Long before Marty McFly ever touched a hoverboard or dodged a bully named Biff, Back to the Future was just a stubborn idea living in the mind of screenwriter Bob Gale. The story goes that Gale found his own father's high school yearbook and was struck by a strange thought. What would it have been like to actually know his dad as a teenager, not as a parent, but as a peer? He brought the idea to his writing partner and future director, Robert Zemeckis, and the two of them built an entire film around that single spark of curiosity. What they didn't expect was just how hard it would be to convince anyone else that the idea had legs. Throughout the early 1980s, the script bounced from studio to studio, collecting rejection after rejection. By some accounts, more than 40 production companies passed on it. The reasoning wasn't that the story lacked imagination. It was the opposite problem. Studio executives at the time were chasing raunchier, more adult-oriented comedies, and a heartfelt, family-friendly time travel adventure didn't fit the mold executives were looking for. Zemeckis and Gale were told, more than once, that their film was simply too wholesome to sell tickets. Everything changed when Zemeckis found unrelated success directing Romancing the Stone in 1984. The film became a box office hit, and suddenly the same executives who had turned him away were eager to hear his pitch again. Universal Pictures picked up Back to the Future, and after years of closed doors, production finally began. But landing a studio deal didn't mean the hard part was over. Casting introduced a whole new set of headaches, the biggest of which involved the leading role itself. From the very beginning, Zemeckis and Gale had one actor in mind for Marty McFly, Michael J. Fox. He had the right blend of youthful energy, comedic timing, and everyman charm that the character demanded. There was just one enormous obstacle. Fox was under contract for the sitcom Family Ties, and the show's producers were unwilling to let him take time off for a film shoot. With their first choice unavailable, the production moved forward with actor Eric Stoltz in the role instead. Weeks of filming took place with Stoltz as Marty, and by most accounts, the footage simply wasn't working. Stoltz was a talented performer, but his interpretation of the character leaned dramatic and intense, when the role called for someone lighter, quicker, and more mischievous. Zemeckis eventually made the difficult call to recast the part entirely, a decision that meant reshooting weeks of already completed scenes and absorbing a significant financial hit. Fortunately for the production, circumstances shifted, and Michael J. Fox became available to step into the role. He would spend his days filming Family Ties and his nights shooting Back to the Future, a grueling schedule that reportedly left him running on minimal sleep for months. It was an enormous gamble, but it paid off. When the film premiered in the summer of 1985, it became the highest-grossing movie of the year, took in hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, and turned Michael J. Fox into a household name almost overnight. Yet even with all that success, remnants of the abandoned Stoltz footage never fully disappeared from the final cut, and that fact would go on to fuel one of the most persistent pieces of trivia about the film for decades to come. If you watch the diner scene, where Marty finally snaps and punches Biff Tannen square in the jaw, you're technically not watching Michael J. Fox throw that punch. According to cast members who have discussed the shoot over the years, the connecting fist in that shot originally belonged to Eric Stoltz, left over from before the recasting. Rather than reshoot the entire sequence from scratch, editors were able to use the existing footage seamlessly, blending Stoltz's punch with Fox's performance in the surrounding frames. It's a small, almost invisible detail, but it says a lot about how much material had already been shot before the production made its dramatic pivot. Weeks of footage, an entire actor's performance, thrown away except for the handful of frames that could be repurposed. It's the kind of behind-the-scenes fact that changes how you watch a scene you thought you knew by heart. Casting drama didn't end with the lead role. When Back to the Future Part 2 went into production in the late 1980s, the filmmakers ran into a problem with a different character entirely. George McFly, Marty's father, originally played by Crispin Glover. Glover had been a key part of what made the first film work. His portrayal of George, awkward, timid, and eventually triumphant, gave the story its emotional backbone. But when the sequel came around, Glover and the production could not reach an agreement. Reports at the time suggested he was offered significantly less money than his co-stars, and Glover also had creative objections to where the story was heading, particularly disliking the first film's ending, which he felt implied that wealth and material success were the reward for personal growth. Negotiations broke down, and instead of simply casting a new actor to play George McFly moving forward, the filmmakers made an unusual choice. They took a prosthetic mold that had originally been created of Glover's face during production of the first movie and applied it to a different actor, Jeffrey Weissman, in an attempt to visually replicate Glover's appearance without paying or crediting him for it. When Glover found out, his frustration wasn't about someone else taking over the role. He was on record saying that if the studio had simply hired another actor to play the part, he would have had no objection whatsoever. That would have been a completely ordinary and legal decision. What upset him was that his own likeness, without his permission, had effectively been recreated and placed on screen. He filed a lawsuit against the production, and the case was eventually settled outside of court. The impact of that dispute reached far beyond the film itself. It forced the entertainment industry to grapple with questions that hadn't been fully addressed in contracts up to that point. Who actually owns the rights to an actor's face and likeness once they leave a production? Can a studio recreate someone's appearance using materials gathered while they were still under contract? In the years that followed, actor contracts began including much more detailed clauses specifically covering likeness rights, largely as a direct result of what happened with George McFly. Given how relevant questions of digital likeness and AI-generated faces have become in more recent years, it's worth noting that this legal groundwork was being laid all the way back in the late 1980s. While lawyers were sorting out likeness rights behind the scenes, Michael J. Fox was busy turning himself into something closer to a stunt performer than a sitcom actor. Watching Back to the Future, it's easy to assume Marty McFly was simply written as a naturally talented skateboarder and guitarist. In reality, Fox had to learn almost every one of those skills from scratch, often under serious time pressure. Take the now iconic performance of Johnny B. Good at the high school dance. Even though the musical track had already been recorded in studio, Fox worked closely with a guitar instructor to learn the solo note for note, ensuring his hand movements matched the music perfectly on screen. He studied classic rock performers to nail the physicality of the moment too, the jumps, the slides, the exaggerated showmanship, working with a choreographer until those movements looked completely natural rather than rehearsed. Skateboarding presented its own challenge. At the time the film was shot, skateboarding hadn't yet become the polished, camera-ready activity it is today, and Fox had to train extensively to pull off the stunts convincingly. By the time filming wrapped, he could ride and balance as though he had been doing it his entire life. The demands only grew heavier in Back to the Future Part 3, which shifted the story to the Old West. Suddenly, Fox needed to convincingly ride horses, handle a lasso, and hold a firearm in a tense standoff. He trained hard for all of it, and by his own admission in interviews years later, he ended up learning what he jokingly called 1,000,000 different skills for these films, most of which he laughed he could no longer perform at all once the camera stopped rolling. It wasn't about building lifelong expertise. It was about mastering an incredibly specific skill just long enough to make a scene look real, then moving straight on to the next challenge. The technical side of the production had to keep pace with Fox's performance too. Later films require Marty to interact with multiple versions of himself on screen simultaneously, which meant the special effects team needed a way to combine several takes of Fox into one seamless shot. Industrial Light and Magic developed a specialized motion control camera system for exactly this purpose, allowing the camera to repeat identical movements across multiple takes so that different versions of the same character could appear to occupy the same space naturally. It was a genuinely innovative solution for its time, and it only worked because Fox's individual performances were consistent enough to be stitched together convincingly. With all that context in mind, we finally arrive at the blooper this video promised, the one that stayed in the finished film for the world to see, uncorrected for decades. Early in Back to the Future, Marty records a videotape of Doc Brown to bring back with him to 1955, hoping to convince the past version of Doc that time travel is real and that danger is coming. When that tape plays for 1955 Doc, the recording captures him clearly explaining the mechanics of time travel and delivering the now-famous line, "Never mind that now." It's a tense, pivotal scene, and it plays completely straight. Here's the catch. When Marty actually filmed that recording earlier in the story, the camera he was using was hanging down at his side. It was not pointed at Doc Brown in any way that would have allowed it to capture footage of him at all. By the internal logic of the film's own camera work, the recording should be nothing but a shaky shot of the ground or Marty's own legs. And yet, when the tape plays back later in the story, it shows a perfectly framed, perfectly captured explanation from Doc, exactly as if a professional camera operator had been standing there the whole time. It's a continuity error that completely contradicts what viewers watched happen just scenes earlier, but the surrounding drama of the moment is so effective that audiences overwhelmingly did not question it during the theatrical run. It took repeated home viewings, freeze frames, and years of dedicated fan discussion before this contradiction became one of the most talked about inconsistencies in the entire trilogy. Once it's pointed out, it becomes impossible not to notice every time you rewatch the scene, which is exactly why this small detail has earned such a devoted following among fans of the film. Once fans started hunting for inconsistencies, they found that the videotape scene was far from the only oddity buried in the trilogy. Consider the Save the Clock Tower flyer that becomes such an important prop throughout the story. Marty first receives it from a local woman campaigning to preserve Hill Valley's courthouse clock, and later Jennifer writes a personal note on the back of it for him to keep. Watch closely across different scenes, though, and the flyer's condition changes dramatically, sometimes crisp and freshly printed, other times crumpled and worn, seemingly at random, depending on the shot. Even stranger, in at least one moment, Jennifer's handwritten note appears to already be visible on the back of the flyer before she has actually written it in the story's timeline. Then there's the background extra in the same clock tower scene who appears to be caught in an unintentional loop, walking around the same corner more than once in the same direction, almost as though the footage were looped or the same actor was used twice in the background without anyone noticing during editing. Given the film's subject matter, fans have half-jokingly pointed to this as an accidental nod to the movie's own themes of repetition and time loops, even though it was clearly just an editing oversight. Smaller details pile up throughout the trilogy as well. A hand shown flipping through a phone book in one scene appears noticeably older than Marty's own hand should look. A remote control used to operate the DeLorean is shown with a readout of 0 volts, despite still functioning perfectly. Lighting shifts subtly within scenes that are supposed to take place in a single continuous hallway. None of these were intentional choices. They're the natural byproduct of a big production working against tight deadlines. But collectively, they become beloved trivia among longtime fans, adding a layer of texture to a film people have already watched dozens of times. Not every memorable moment tied to the film came from a mistake. Some of the most fascinating stories involve things the filmmakers got exactly right, and one line in particular reached far beyond the walls of any movie theater. In the film, Marty desperately tries to convince the 1955 version of Doc Brown that he really has traveled from the future. As proof of how far-fetched his situation sounds, Marty mentions that Ronald Reagan is the President of the United States in 1985. Doc's stunned reaction, throwing his head back and shouting in disbelief, lands as one of the film's funniest beats because in 1955, Reagan was known almost exclusively as a Hollywood actor, not a political figure. According to widely reported accounts, when the film was screened at the White House, Reagan reportedly found the joke so amusing that he asked for the scene to be rewound and played again. He was, by most descriptions, more than happy to laugh at a lighthearted jab at his own past career. The connection between Reagan and the film didn't end there. During his 1986 State of the Union address, Reagan quoted one of the movie's most iconic lines directly, referencing Doc Brown's declaration about not needing roads as a way of expressing optimism about the country's future. It was an extraordinary crossover moment between Hollywood entertainment and the highest levels of American politics, and it underscored just how quickly the film had embedded itself into the broader cultural conversation. For as playful and lighthearted as the finished films feel, the productions themselves were not without real danger. The cast frequently pushed themselves into physically demanding, sometimes outright risky situations to make each scene believable. Actor Thomas F. Wilson, who played the trilogy's recurring antagonist Biff Tannen, took his commitment especially seriously in Back to the Future Part 3, where his character became a rough, Old West outlaw. Wilson spent considerable time learning to ride horses and handle a lasso, so that his own stunts could be filmed without a double standing in for him. His dedication paid off in a performance that felt genuinely at home in a Western setting, rather than like a modern actor awkwardly transplanted into period costume. Christopher Lloyd, who had spent 2 films establishing Doc Brown as an eccentric comedic scientist, faced a very different kind of challenge in the 3rd installment. The story introduced a romantic subplot between Doc and Clara Clayton, a schoolteacher played by Mary Steenburgen, giving Lloyd his first on-screen kiss in the role. For an actor whose career had largely been built around exaggerated, comedic characters, bringing genuine tenderness to that moment required a noticeably different register of performance, and it added an unexpected emotional depth to a character audiences thought they already understood completely. The most dangerous moment of the entire trilogy, however, came during the filming of a hanging scene in Back to the Future Part 3, where Mad Dog Tannen's gang attempts to hang Marty. What was meant to be a carefully controlled stunt went wrong when the rope actually restricted Fox's air supply during filming. He reportedly lost consciousness for several seconds before the crew recognized what was happening and intervened. Fox has since spoken about how frightening that experience was, describing in later interviews as a genuine brush with serious injury, hidden behind what audiences simply saw as another tense action beat in the film. Creative tensions ran high off-camera as well. During production of the first film, Crispin Glover reportedly clashed intensely with director Robert Zemeckis over how his character should behave in a particular scene, with the disagreement growing loud enough that other cast members retreated to their dressing rooms to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. It's a reminder that even a film remembered today for its warmth and humor was, at various points, the product of genuine friction between passionate collaborators who cared deeply about getting the story right. Perhaps the most fascinating trivia surrounding the trilogy involves the version of the story that never made it to screen at all. Early drafts of Back to the Future Part 2 reportedly sent the time machine to the 1960s rather than the futuristic 2015 audiences eventually saw. Under that version of the story, Marty's mother Lorraine was imagined as a rebellious flower child type who ends up in legal trouble, while Doc Brown was written experimenting with substances associated with the counterculture movement of the era. It would have been an almost unrecognizably different film, one steeped far more heavily in the specific social upheaval of that decade, rather than the technology-driven vision of the future the finished movie ultimately delivered. Zemeckis eventually steered the story in a different direction, choosing instead to revisit the events of the original film from a new perspective, a decision that produced one of the more structurally unusual sequels of its era. Casting decisions also came surprisingly close to looking completely different. While Christopher Lloyd feels inseparable from the role of Doc Brown today, other actors were reportedly considered for the part during earlier stages of development, including Jeff Goldblum, whose distinctively quirky energy might have produced a dramatically different interpretation of character. It's genuinely difficult to picture the franchise without Lloyd's manic energy in the role, which makes these alternate casting possibilities all the more interesting to imagine. Beyond continuity slip-ups, the trilogy contains a handful of small factual inaccuracies that dedicated fans have delighted in pointing out over the years. In one scene, Doc casually mentions setting the time machine to witness the birth of Christ, referencing a year that doesn't actually exist on the calendar, since history moves directly from 1 BC to 1 AD with no year zero in between. It's a throwaway joke rather than a serious attempt at historical accuracy, but attentive viewers have never let it slide entirely. Another frequently cited inconsistency involves the way plutonium is depicted in the film, shown as a glowing red liquid stored in a glass tube, when in reality plutonium is a solid, silvery metal. There's also a minor mismatch involving a television episode Marty casually references watching on a specific date in 1955, which doesn't line up with what was actually broadcast that evening according to historical records. None of these details would ever derail someone's enjoyment of the film on a casual viewing, but they become exactly the kind of trivia that keeps longtime fans coming back to rewatch these movies with a magnifying glass. None of this diminishes what Back to the Future accomplished. If anything, it does the opposite. A film built on rejected pitches, a recast lead actor, borrowed footage, contested likeness rights, dangerous stunts gone wrong, and a handful of continuity slip-ups somehow still became one of the most beloved and enduring stories in American film history. It was preserved by the Library of Congress as a work of cultural significance, quoted by a sitting president, and embraced across generations of audiences who quote its lines from memory decades later. The mistakes didn't weaken that legacy. They became part of it. They're proof that behind every scene that looks effortless on screen, there were real people working under real pressure, making imperfect decisions in the moment, and somehow turning all of that chaos into something audiences still can't stop watching. The videotape scene that shouldn't logically exist, the flyer that changes texture between shots, the extra who seems to loop through the background. These aren't flaws that ruin the movie. They're small, human fingerprints left behind on a film about bending the rules of time itself. So the next time you sit down to rewatch Back to the Future, pay close attention to that camera hanging at Marty's side. Watch what it should be capturing, and then watch what actually plays back moments later. It's been there the whole time, unedited and unnoticed by millions of viewers, waiting for someone to finally take a closer look. Did you already know about this mistake? Or is this the first time you're hearing about it? Let us know in the comments below.